Hello, everybody. So today we're going to be discussing a new unit, and the new unit is going to have to do with different approaches altogether to the classical approaches to the basic epistemic questions we were discussing. And one of the things that might motivate taking a different perspective is to ask the question, what is the value of these epistemic states that we seek, whether it be wisdom, understanding, knowledge, true belief, true opinion, justification? What is valuable about each of these things? Why do we care about it? It was fairly clear why we cared about justification. It was initially because it's something that's supposed to help us get this thing, knowledge. But why do we value knowledge? We'll discuss this in more detail for our next class discussing the Meno. But for today, I want to consider a view called pragmatism. Pragmatism is a view on which sometimes non-purely epistemic reasons can count as reasons to believe something. Pragmatic reasons are reasons that have to do with the practical value of something, how useful it is to me, how convenient it is for me, or for someone else. Pragmatists tend to hold the view, sometimes hold the view, that practical values bear on beliefs because they think that practical values can swamp epistemic values, even if they're otherwise independent. So this is a view that we're going to explore today, held by the philosopher William James. And James was in a massive disagreement with this philosopher named Clifford. William Kingdon Clifford was a philosopher who believed that evidence was the only good reason to believe something. And he had a little thought experiment that he liked for showing this. Suppose that, there's a ship owner who has been worried about the state of repair of his ship, and worries about this have kept him from going out to sea. But he manages somehow to convince himself that it's probably going to be fine. His ship is going to be able to make this next voyage. And he convinces himself so much that he completely calms down and proceeds with his planned voyage. Now what happens is, as Clifford imagines it, the man gets to the middle of the ocean on his ship with his crew, and there's a storm and the ship can't hold it together. The ship is irreparably broken and everybody on the ship drowns. Clifford thinks that something has gone gravely wrong here. This ship owner has been irresponsible, culpably negligent in the way that he went about acquiring his beliefs. He maybe genuinely held the belief that his ship was going to be fine, but he held the belief in the face of very strong conflicting evidence. Clifford takes this thought experiment to show, and I quote, "It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence." Clifford completely condemns the idea that you should be able, not only ethically, but epistemically, to convince yourself to believe anything that doesn't fit your evidence. William James is essentially responding to this argument of Clifford's. James has a concern about the status of religious belief. Let's suppose that there's no evidence, positive or negative, in favor of or against holding belief in the existence of a supreme being. Suppose that everything in the world is inconclusive with respect to this question. James supposes this, and he has an argument that he takes to show that even if we have no evidence bearing on this question, we can still have justification for believing in a supreme being. And this justification is based on essentially pragmatic reasons. So even though we are talking about this issue in the context of religious belief, the implications expand beyond it. And now James's argument is actually quite targeted. You could understand James's argument as inconclusive with respect to whether pragmatism is true about all belief. But as I'll suggest later in the lecture, there are important takeaway lessons from James's exposition that might lead us to conclude that pragmatism does have a plausible argument for why pragmatic reasons might affect our attributions of knowledge and our attributions of justification for knowers in other contexts. So let's get a definition down. Let's define pragmatism as follows. There are practical conditions on knowing. For example, a subject is justified in believing a particular proposition, that P, only if the subject is rational to prefer and hence act as if P. This is a definition coming from Fantel and McGrath, 2002. You can also take a look at Pascal's wager for an example of a claim like this. All right, so that's just a technical definition for everybody. Let's get into James's paper. James argues that we can believe certain things even when we don't have sufficient evidence. Traditionally, this has been seen as an argument resisting evidentialism, but as you can probably already tell from my framing, it goes beyond evidentialism. It embraces pragmatic encroachment. He does not think that the only good reason to believe is to have evidence. Sometimes we can lack evidence for a claim and still be justified in believing it. And when does that happen? James gives us 3 conditions, and they're pretty strong conditions. So there will be lots of cases in which we don't meet the conditions. First of all, I'll need to make 3 different distinctions. Distinguish between live and dead hypotheses. A live hypothesis is one to which I think there is some probability of it happening. It's one that I consider to be a viable hypothesis about the way things might be. And a dead hypothesis is one that I just assign no probability to, or such a low probability that I can basically discount it. I can't genuinely bring myself to consider it. I can't bring myself to consider it as a genuine option for belief. So one thing that's important already in this distinction is that different thinkers will differ with respect to what options are live and dead to them to believe. For me, with my cultural background, certain Abrahamic religious principles are live hypotheses. They're things that I could possibly get myself to believe in. A belief in a great supreme pumpkin, which is James's example, is a dead hypothesis to me. I can't bring myself to see that as a viable option for belief. It's a dead hypothesis to me. Now, second distinction. Distinguish between forced options on the one hand and avoidable options on the other hand. Here we're defining an option as a decision between 2 or more hypotheses, 2 or more propositions. A forced option is one where the options that you have, the hypotheses that you have, exhaust the possible actions for what to believe. For example, go out or don't go out. If I'm giving you that choice, it's a forced choice. Anything that you do, you're essentially picking between these 2. That's a forced option.
Should I stay or should I go now?
Bake a cake or a pie, on the other hand, is not forced. It's avoidable. I could avoid the issue altogether by not baking anything at all. According to James, we can speak then of making epistemic decisions. So when someone says to me, please believe me, or when I say, I choose to believe she'll be all right, I'm demonstrating that I think that I can make choices about beliefs. Remember when we talked about this, this is doxastic voluntarism. James is embracing the view that you have choices about what to believe, that believing is like an action that you take. Finally, last distinction that's important to us, James distinguishes between options that are momentous and options that are trivial. And this distinction has to do with what the stakes are of belief. So a momentous option is one where you have a unique opportunity where the choice is irreversible. You can't change your mind after you've made it. And the stakes are high. There's a lot to be lost and a limited chance to seize the moment, basically. So that's the momentous option. That's to be contrasted with a trivial option, one where the opportunity to do something or to believe something comes about all the time, or it's a mundane choice, or where I can change my mind after I've already made the choice and it'll be fine. To give you an applied example, suppose that you were called on the phone and someone told you, hey, Guess what? Congratulations, you've won an all expenses paid trip to the International Space Station for a week. It's one time only. You've got to pack your bags and be ready on Monday. And we will send you a bus and pick you up. And if you're not ready to go, we're going to leave without you. So just make up your mind by Monday morning. That's a momentous option. How often is someone going to call you on the phone and tell you you have an all expenses paid trip to the International Space Station? How often are you going to get the chance to go to space? Not very often. And you can't change your mind. The moment when the bus arrives, you've either made the decision or you haven't. If you haven't made the decision, you're essentially opting out. So it's a big deal. A trivial option is something like, hey, we could watch a movie tonight. How about we watch the wonderful Gene Wilder movie, Young Frankenstein?
That's Frankenstein.
Now, whichever film you pick, maybe you can even decide not to watch a film. You're not going to be affecting anything too great. You know, it's sort of trivial. You can always have the option again to come back and consider watching a movie. There's many places where you can rent and buy movies now, sometimes at the click of a button. So not momentous, actually, very trivial decision. Although you should watch Gene Wilder movies. They're all very good.
Yes, I think we could all use a good laugh. But don't see it alone.
So those are our three distinctions. The distinction between live hypotheses and dead hypotheses, options that are live to me, that are possible for me to choose to believe, and dead ones which I can't choose to believe in. Forced and avoidable options, where the hypotheses in question either exhaust all the possibilities for belief or don't. And finally, momentous and trivial options. Momentous options are the ones that are very high stakes and only come around once in a blue moon, and I have only one opportunity for choice. And trivial options, which are, you know, as it sounds, trivial. They come around all the time, lots of ways to end up doing that thing, so it's not a big deal. It might be important to note that some of these might be graded notions. So momentousness might be a matter of degree. How live a hypothesis is to you might be a matter of degree. That's okay. That will work okay with James's theory. So now we put this all together. James thinks that certain of our options will be what he calls a genuine option for belief without evidence. Sometimes we will be justified in believing without evidence, and that's described by the genuine option. A genuine option arises when the hypotheses for consideration are all live hypotheses for me, when the option is forced, that is, the hypotheses are exhaustive, and when it's a momentous choice for belief. So it's a high stakes situation. What do you think? Is it going to be high stakes? It's going to be high stakes. James claims that the choice between theism and atheism involves a genuine option for most of us. And you can just kind of say the moment that matters maybe for at least the afterlife part of your spiritual belief is the moment before you die. Whatever you believe before you die, that's maybe what matters the most for your status as a religious believer, at least according to a lot of religious systems, not all of them. So that's the sense in which it's a momentous option. You know, you could get infinite pleasure in the afterlife on certain views, or at least be absolved from infinite suffering, depending on whether or not you believe. So religious belief, James thinks, is a genuine option. All of your options are exhausted by the live hypotheses that you might consider, and you have to, at some point in your life, make a choice among them. It's a big deal. The consequences are rather large, depending on what your belief is. James thinks then that this is a situation in which you're allowed to believe without evidence. You're sort of stuck against a wall. It's such a high stakes issue, and it's exhausted, you sort of can't help but make a choice. So you would be justified in believing on the basis of pragmatic reasons. James uses these notions to argue, one, for most people, the decision between theism and atheism is a genuine option. Two, that a genuine option is one where one must will a belief in one or the other option. Three, when we have no choice but to will one belief or another, doing so is rational. Therefore, willing a belief in a live hypothesis, even in the absence of sufficient evidence, can sometimes be rational. It is a rational response to a genuine option. Out of all of these, you might think that the third premise seems like the one most in need of defending, the premise that we have no choice but to will one belief or another. How can we understand James's defense of this premise? And furthermore, how does evidence work on this picture? At what point in the decision does evidence come in? Or is it left out altogether? And does that matter? A couple of questions we can ask. One is, do you find this argument plausible? Do you think that such a situation is one in which you'd be permitted to believe without evidence? And furthermore, do you think that this permissiveness of believing without evidence in these cases amounts to justification? This is a key, right? Is what you have epistemic justification for belief? Or is it similarly epistemic? Does it matter if it's epistemic or not, if the thing that you're allowed to do at the end is to believe? And maybe an additional set of interesting questions to think about. Can a hypothesis that's dead to you become alive again? What would that take? And what would it take for a live hypothesis, something that you can genuinely think is an option for belief, to become a dead hypothesis for you, one that wouldn't really be a viable option for belief anymore? Food for thought. All right, so how seriously should we take James's view as a problem for evidentialism? If you recall, his argument about religious belief really only affects a very narrow band of hypotheses, ones that are couched in a genuine option. They have to be live, they've got to be momentous, and they've got to be forced choices. And there won't be too many cases that fit that situation. So in a sense, James's suggestion is quite mild. But now I'm going to talk to you about some aspects of pragmatism that get us to think bigger picture than this. So it will turn out, if the pragmatist is right, that almost every case of forming beliefs will be one in which my beliefs are somewhat influenced by practical or pragmatic considerations that are not purely epistemic. So it's not purely based on evidence. The way to get to this question is to take the following characterization of what we're doing when we're engaging in this project of being a knower. We're trying to follow a couple of rules. And when I say a couple, I really mean two. The rules are: believe truths, believe things that are true, aim your belief at truths, and avoid believing falsehoods. Avoid forming beliefs in false things. Don't aim your beliefs at falsehoods. Pretty simple, right? If you follow both norms, you'll be doing a great job as a knower, as an inquirer, as a person. James argues, though, that sometimes we can overemphasize the norm, avoid believing falsehoods. He thinks that sometimes we face decisions where we have an equal risk of violating that norm, no matter what option we choose. And those might be cases like the religious belief case, because maybe all of the options that we have aren't accurate, or like we're just not thinking of the right one, or where we just don't have enough information to deliberately avoid believing something false. Let me give you some examples of cases in which these norms actually might conflict with each other, or where the norms affect whether we think someone is justified or not justified in believing something. So what situations are ones that require you to be more skeptical, that require you to place more emphasis on avoiding believing falsehoods? Well, those are situations in which believing the wrong thing will get you into a lot of trouble. Suppose you're, I don't know, developing a vaccine for a very large population. In that case, believing the wrong thing about what vaccine works and what side effects the vaccine has very dire consequences. So you definitely want to prioritize that norm, avoid believing things that are false, and also avoid asserting things that are false. You could hurt people. You do also, of course, want to believe things that are true about what you're producing, but it matters more that you not accidentally or non-accidentally believe anything false. You want to withhold your belief until you're absolutely certain that you're not going to get anything wrong. But there are other cases in which the norms maybe will be flipped, cases in which it makes more sense to have a lower threshold for belief. Suppose that you're a doctor and you have a patient coming in complaining of chest pain. Now, chest pain is sometimes a benign symptom. Sometimes it's just heartburn, and it's not a big deal. Sometimes chest pain indicates actually something very serious, like a heart attack or a problem in your lungs. So suppose that you're a doctor in this situation and you have a patient complaining of chest pain. The right thing to do is to lower your threshold for belief and maybe believe or act as if you believe that something very serious is happening. So you put the patient through a rigorous set of tests to verify that they're not seriously ill. You believe that they're seriously ill until proven otherwise, essentially. And that's a case where we care more about making sure that we're not missing a true belief about their being seriously ill before we dismiss it and just sort of give them some heartburn medication and make them go home. You can take these sorts of scenarios to extremes. You can imagine a non-existent person who follows only one of these norms. You can imagine a person who's hyper skeptical, who refuses to believe absolutely anything because they just think they'll lose epistemic points if they believe anything false. And so they go through the world and essentially don't believe anything. What would that person be like? What mistakes would that person make? Presumably a lot. You can also imagine a person that goes around only trying as much as possible to maximize the true things that they believe. They would be very credulous, right? They'd end up believing anything that you suggested to them because they'd be scared of avoiding an opportunity to believe something true. And they'd be super gullible. They'd probably fall victim to a ton of scams. They'd believe all the conspiracy theories, and that's bad. We don't want to be either person, so we definitely want to balance our norms. But the doctor case and the vaccination case show us that sometimes pragmatic considerations might affect when we think that a particular believer is justified in having a particular belief. The practical considerations of the vaccine developer's case and the medical doctor's case affect whether or not we think that it makes sense for them to believe certain things. That suggests that pragmatic norms have an influence on epistemic attributions. So it suggests that they affect our assessments of epistemic justification. Now, this brings in a lot of additional issues because some people like to think that our epistemic norms and epistemic values are values in understanding, knowledge, evidence, justification, reliability, all these things. They're kind of in one box of norms and rules. And our ethical and practical considerations are in a different box of norms and rules. You know, how pleasurable certain situations are, how in keeping with human dignity our actions are, how much happiness our actions will produce. And there are norms of practical rationality that govern what makes sense to do in the sense of actions out in the world. And then there's a different set of norms that govern what we should believe, which is not an action exactly on that sort of traditional view. You've got these two different normative spheres. Pragmatism comes in like a wrecking ball, if you will, and smushes these together. Suddenly you get pragmatic encroachment. Your practical reasons start trickling in and affecting your epistemic reasons. So maybe it turns out that reasons are really more of a holistic thing. You can compare ethical, pragmatic, epistemic reasons for believing things with each other. They affect each other. And this is, for some people, very worrisome and terrible. Now, I will leave it to you to decide how good or bad it is to think like this, to think that there's a theory that can make sense of believing without evidence. If you were to disagree with James or with this pragmatism setup, how would you go about doing it? What assumption are we making here that is problematic? Is there a way to explain away the intuitive characterization of the vaccine case and the medical doctor case, or not? Maybe you think that there's a way of placing a description of the value of epistemic states, like true belief, that is distinct from their value that is an upshot of believing the truth, right? So there's maybe an intrinsic value to believing truly that doesn't have to do with its consequences for us. And if that's true, then maybe you can make sense of the norms being distinct, the ones that tell you evidentially, for example, this is what you should believe and why you should believe it, but pragmatically, maybe you get reasons that point in a different direction. And sometimes you'll get a conflict between these norms, but there will still be true things to say. The pragmatist is suggesting that that separation doesn't make sense at a fundamental level, because the value of each of these end states, these desirable states of believing truths and avoiding believing falsehoods, have a value that is pragmatic in the end. And we come to discover this when we look at real life applications. So next time, I would like to discuss with you the issue of whether there is an intrinsic value to knowledge, whether there is a non-pragmatic value to having not only true beliefs and not only true justified beliefs, but actually knowledge. And maybe you think that there's also a value to other types of intrinsically epistemic states like wisdom or understanding. Do you think that those things have a value independently of what use they have for us? Is it just something like a treasure that's worth pursuing for its own sake? Now, I'll close by mentioning one last thing, which is that James's argument for belief without evidence being justified in certain cases depends on a thesis called doxastic voluntarism. It depends on saying that you are able to choose what you believe, that you're able to will what to believe. It doesn't seem a lot of the time like we really control what we believe. A lot of my beliefs arise involuntarily without my input. It's just sort of the way things seem to me has a tendency to produce belief in me. So what is James's response to this worry? And do you think his response works? Or maybe a different question, is there a way to avoid accepting doxastic voluntarism in the first place? Remember what I mentioned about the things we frequently say? I choose to believe you will be all right. Please believe me, I plead. All right, so that's it for today. That's on willing to believe and believing without evidence. I hope you find this topic interesting and exciting as I do, and I look forward to discussing it with you in class. See you.